Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a place that looks like it belongs in a postcard, but, naturally, was far less relaxing in real life. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your thoughts slow down as we wander, very gently, into the cold stone corridors of the Tower of London, a place where many arrived, and not all of them left in particularly good spirits. Now, despite its rather dramatic reputation, the Tower wasn't always a place of constant screaming and chaos. In fact, it was surprisingly organised. Because of course it was. If you're going to imprison important people, you might as well do it properly. Most prisoners sent here were not your average pickpockets or loaf thieves. No, these were nobles, political rivals, inconvenient spouses, and occasionally someone who simply annoyed the wrong person at the wrong time, which, as it turns out, was quite easy to do. Let's begin with the arrival. Imagine approaching the tower by boat, gliding slowly along the River Thames. It might even feel peaceful, until you pass under Traitors Gate, a name that, rather unhelpfully, tells you exactly how this visit is expected to go. Once inside, things varied quite a bit depending on who you were. If you were wealthy or important, your imprisonment might resemble a very strict, very unpleasant hotel stay. You could have servants, decent food, and even books, because nothing says you are under suspicion of treason, quite like a quiet evening of reading by candlelight. But if you were less fortunate, well, the accommodations became considerably less charming. Cold stone rooms, damp air, straw on the floor, if you were lucky, and a general sense that no one was in a hurry to make your stay comfortable. Or brief. Now, let's drift toward one of the Tower's more famous guests, a woman who arrived as a queen, and left as a cautionary tale. Anne Boleyn. She entered the Tower not as a prisoner in chains, but in a royal barge, much like she had for her coronation, which is, in hindsight, a rather unsettling bit of symmetry. Because, of course, history enjoys a bit of irony. At first, she was lodged in relatively comfortable quarters. She even recognised the rooms, having stayed there before during happier times. Though happy might not be the word she would use now. Her days were quiet, filled with waiting, thinking, perhaps replaying every conversation that had led her here, and, inevitably, realising that none of it could be undone. There were no dramatic outbursts, no grand speeches, just a slow, steady acceptance that the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond those stone walls. And this was often the true nature of the Tower. Not chaos, not constant terror, but waiting, long stretches of silence, broken only by footsteps in the corridor, the turning of a key, the quiet understanding that power, once lost, rarely comes back, especially when kings are involved. Let's drift a little further, because Anne, as it turns out, was far from the only one to experience this particular kind of stillness. Let's drift a little further down those quiet stone corridors, where the air feels just a bit heavier, and the stories become softer, but somehow more unsettling. Because not all prisoners in the Tower were powerful adults, making careful calculations about their fate. Some were just children. Now, of all the stories tied to the Tower of London, few are as quietly haunting as that of the young King Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury. They arrived not as traitors, but as royalty, which, as it turns out, did not guarantee a comfortable outcome. It rarely did. Edward was only around 12 years old, which is an age where one might reasonably expect to be concerned with tutors, games, or perhaps avoiding vegetables. Instead, he was being escorted to the Tower in preparation for his coronation, because, naturally, the Tower was also used as a royal residence before such ceremonies, a sort of temporary stop before becoming king. At least, that was the idea. At first, everything seemed almost normal. The boys were seen walking in the gardens, speaking with attendants, and behaving very much like children, placed in a situation they didn't fully understand. But then, slowly, they were seen less often. Fewer walks, fewer glimpses through the windows, fewer quiet reassurances that everything was proceeding as it should, until, eventually, nothing at all. No announcements, no explanations, just an absence that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Now, their uncle, Richard Mac, had taken control of the situation. And by control, we mean he had arranged things in such a way that he, rather conveniently, became king instead. Because of course he did. Officially, the boys were declared illegitimate, a legal detail that solved many problems. At least on paper. In reality, it raised far more questions than it answered. And the most persistent question of all was simply this: what happened to them? The Tower, as you might expect, did not offer many clues. Aitia remained quiet, still, unhelpfully silent in the way that old stone buildings tend to be. Years later, rumours drifted through England. Whispers of foul play, of nighttime visits, of decisions made behind closed doors, in hushed voices that never quite reached the outside world. Some claimed the boys were quietly removed. Others believed they never left at all. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the story is that no one can say for certain there were no final speeches, no dramatic endings, just two young lives, gradually fading from view, as if they had simply stepped into the shadows and chosen not to return, which, for the Tower of London, was not entirely unusual, because this place, for all its structure and order, had a way of absorbing people, of turning their stories into echoes, half-remembered and gently debated across centuries. And so, the corridors remained as they always were. Quiet, patient, and, in their own way, very good at keeping secrets. Let's continue on. Because, as it turns out, some prisoners did leave the Tower, though not always in the way they might have preferred. Let's continue, gently, along these worn stone paths, where time seems to slow just a little more than usual, because while some prisoners vanished into uncertainty, others were given something that feels, at first glance, almost generous. Oh, trial. Now, a trial in Tudor England was an interesting experience. Not always in the way one might hope. Evidence could be flexible, outcomes rather predictable, and the conclusion often felt decided well before anyone entered the room. But still, it offered a kind of structure, a beginning, a middle, and inevitably an ending. One of the more notable residents of the Tower was Thomas More, a thoughtful man, quiet, principled, the sort of person who believed that certain lines simply should not be crossed, even when a king politely, and then not so politely, suggested otherwise. He was imprisoned for refusing to accept Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England, which at the time was considered less of a personal opinion and more of a serious inconvenience to the crown. His stay in the Tower was, by most accounts, relatively calm. He was allowed books, writing materials, and even visits from family for a time. A quiet existence, though not a free one. He spent his days reflecting, writing, and, perhaps, preparing himself for what he already understood was coming, because people like Thomas More tended to understand these things. When his trial finally arrived, it unfolded with a certain inevitability. Charges were presented, arguments were made, and the verdict, unsurprisingly, aligned neatly with the king's wishes. He was sentenced to death, and yet there was no dramatic resistance, no desperate last-minute plea, just a composed acceptance, as if he had already made peace with the outcome long before the sentence was spoken aloud. Now, not all prisoners were granted such calm conditions. Let's drift, just slightly, into a darker corner of the Tower's history, where the word confession took on a more persuasive meaning, because, occasionally, the Tower was home to interrogation, and not the gentle, conversational sort. Devices like the rack were used, slowly stretching the body in ways it was never meant to go. A method designed not just to cause pain, but to encourage agreement, because, of course, agreement was the goal. One such prisoner was Guy Fawkes, a man whose name has become oddly festive over the centuries. After his involvement in the Gunpowder Plot, he was brought to the Tower, where he initially resisted questioning for all while. But the Tower was patient. Over time, and with sufficient encouragement, his resistance faded. His signature, once neat and steady, became shaky and uncertain. A small, quiet detail that tells its own story. And so, like many others, he confessed. Not necessarily because he wanted to, but because, in the Tower, wanting had very little to do with it. Eventually, his story moved beyond those stone walls, toward its final, public conclusion, because that, too, was part of the pattern. The Tower was rarely the end. It was the pause before it, a place where outcomes settled into place, where decisions became unavoidable, and where people, whether quietly or reluctantly, came to understand what awaited them next. And so, as the candles burned low and the corridors returned to silence, another chapter would close, almost gently. Let's drift onward, because not every prisoner accepted their fate so quietly. Let's drift onward, a little further along the Tower's quiet edges, where patience occasionally gave way to something else, because, as you might expect, not everyone was content to sit, reflect, and wait for history to make its decision. Some tried to leave. Now, escaping the Tower of London was not, strictly speaking, encouraged. The walls were thick. The guards were alert, or at least alert enough. And the general design of the place suggested that departure without permission would be inconvenient. And yet, people tried anyway. One of the more quietly impressive attempts came from Ranulph Flambard, a man who, it must be said, approached imprisonment with a certain level of creativity. He had been placed in the tower by Henry I, which, as assignments go, was not ideal. But Ranulph was not the sort to accept his surroundings without, at least, a bit of experimentation. At first, he behaved exactly as one might expect, calm, cooperative, even pleasant. He made friends with his guards, shared meals, and gave no indication that he was planning anything particularly unusual, which, naturally, is exactly what he was doing. One evening, after a rather generous serving of wine had been delivered because, of course, it had, Ranulph ensured that the guards enjoyed it thoroughly, perhaps a little too thoroughly, once they were suitably relaxed. He produced a rope that had been smuggled in, hidden cleverly among the supplies. A small detail, easy to overlook, until it becomes very important. Then, with remarkable calm, he climbed out of his window and began to lower himself down the tower wall. Now, this was not a short drop, nor was it especially safe. But at this point, safe was no longer the priority. Freedom was, and, somewhat impressively, it worked. Ranulph reached the ground, disappeared into the night, and, just like that, the tower had lost a prisoner, which must have been mildly embarrassing for everyone involved. Of course, not all escape attempts ended quite so neatly. Some were discovered halfway through. Others failed due to poor timing, unreliable helpers, or the simple fact that climbing down a massive stone fortress is, generally speaking, quite difficult. And then there were those who didn't attempt escape at all, but still managed to leave in unexpected ways. Let's drift, briefly, to a figure who experienced the tower not once, but twice. Elizabeth I. Before she became queen, she was imprisoned there by her half-sister. Mary I, a family dynamic that, like many royal situations, was complicated. Elizabeth arrived under suspicion of involvement in a rebellion, a serious accusation, the kind that often ended badly. Her time in the tower was tense, but controlled. She was watched carefully, questioned occasionally, and left with plenty of time to consider the fragility of her position, because at that moment, her future could have gone in a very different direction, but in a turn that feels almost unusual for the tower. She was released. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just allowed to leave. And years later, she returned again, only this time, not as a prisoner, as queen, which is, admittedly, a rather remarkable change in circumstances. And perhaps that's what makes the tower so quietly fascinating. It wasn't just a place of endings. Sometimes, very rarely, it was a place of pauses, of strange reversals, of moments where fate seemed undecided, until it wasn't. So, as we continue to wander through these dim corridors, we begin to see a pattern. Some stayed, some vanished, some escaped, and all walked back out into the light, as if nothing had happened at all. Let's keep going, because the tower still has a few more stories, waiting patiently in the silence. Let's continue, slowly now, toward a part of the tower that feels a little more finale, because while some stories here linger in uncertainty, others arrive at a conclusion that is carefully arranged, quietly prepared, and, in its own way, almost routine. Execution. Now, despite what films might suggest, these moments were not chaotic spectacles within the tower itself. In fact, executions here were rather selective, reserved for individuals of particular importance or sensitivity, because, naturally, discretion mattered. Most prisoners would eventually be moved elsewhere for a public ending, but all were granted a more private conclusion within the tower walls. A small audience, a controlled setting, and a sense that everything was being handled with a certain amount of care. One such figure was Catherine Howard, another queen whose story did not end especially well under the watchful eye of Henry VIII. She was young, very young, and her time as queen had been brief, marked by courtly expectations, whispered rumours, and, eventually, accusations that could not be ignored, or, perhaps more accurately, were not ignored. When she arrived at the tower, the pattern was already familiar. Rooms prepared, guards assigned, time stretching quietly ahead. It said that in her final days, she practiced placing her head on the executioner's block, which is a detail that feels almost too still to fully absorb. No panic, no dramatic scenes, just a quiet rehearsal for something she knew was coming. Because in the tower, certainty often arrived long before the event itself. On the morning of her execution, everything unfolded with a kind of subdued precision. She was escorted to the scaffold, offered a chance to speak, and then, quite simply, the moment passed. No obstacle, no lingering, just an ending. Let's drift slightly further, because hers was not the only quiet farewell these walls have witnessed. There was also Lady Jane Grey, sometimes called the 9 Days Queen, which, as titles go, feels impressively brief. Jane had never really sought the crown. It was placed upon her through a series of decisions made by people who, unsurprisingly, were not the ones who would face the consequences. When those decisions unravelled, as they tend to do, Jane found herself in the tower. At first, there was hesitation about her fate, discussions, delays, the possibility that she might simply be forgotten, tucked away as a political inconvenience. But rebellions have a way of complicating things. And so, eventually, the decision was made. Her final moments were described as calm, composed, almost reflective. She spoke quietly, acknowledged what was happening, and prepared herself with a steadiness that feels difficult to imagine, because she was, after all, still very young, and yet there was no resistance, only acceptance, and then silence, which, more than anything, seems to be the tower's preferred conclusion. Not loud endings, not dramatic finales, but soft, deliberate conclusions that fade gently into history. So, as we linger here for just a moment longer, in this quiet space where so many stories have reached their end, we begin to understand something about the tower. It wasn't only a place of imprisonment. It was a place of transition, from power to absence, from certainty to memory, and sometimes from life to a story told in hushed voices, centuries later. Let's move on, because even here, not every ending was as simple as it first appeared. Let's continue our slow walk through the tower. But this time, we'll step away from the executions and disappearances and talk about something that feels almost strange to say. Some prisoners actually lived quite comfortably here. Now, comfortable is, of course, a relative term. You were still imprisoned in a large stone fortress, guarded by armed men, and your future was usually uncertain. But if you were rich, noble, or politically important, your stay in the tower could feel less like a dungeon and more like a very strict, very expensive hotel you couldn't leave. Because in Tudor and medieval England, imprisonment was not always about punishment. Sometimes it was simply about control, keeping someone in one place where they couldn't cause trouble, or gather supporters, or marry someone inconvenient. One very good example of this was Charles d'Orleans. He wasn't exactly a criminal. He was captured during the 100 Years' War and brought to England as a high-value prisoner. Instead of a dark cell, he was given relatively comfortable rooms, allowed servants, good food, books, and plenty of time. So much time, in fact, that he began writing poetry. Lots of poetry. He wrote about seasons, dreams, loneliness, and the strange experience of living in a country that wasn't his home, while technically being a prisoner for many years. Nearly 25 years, in fact, which is a very long hotel stay, even by royal standards. But his life in the Tower and other English residences was not miserable in the way we might imagine. He attended feasts, met nobles, and became something of a literary figure while still technically imprisoned, which is a very medieval situation, being both a prisoner and a respected guest at the same time. The Tower had these strange contradictions. One prisoner might be in chains, while another was writing poetry, eating roasted meat, and complaining about English weather. It all depended on status. Another long-term resident was Walter Raleigh, who spent many years imprisoned in the Tower under James I. Raleigh did not spend his time staring sadly at walls. Instead, he wrote books, conducted scientific experiments, grew plants, and even reportedly made herbal medicines while imprisoned. At one point, his cell was full of books, papers, and scientific equipment. It began to look less like a prison cell and more like a slightly messy university office. He wrote a massive book called The History of the World while sitting in the Tower, which is a very productive way to spend imprisonment, all things considered. So the Tower was not just a place of suffering. It was also a place where people waited, wrote, studied, planned, hoped, and sometimes slowly realized that the outside world was continuing without them. Days in the Tower often passed very quietly. Morning light through narrow windows, footsteps in the corridor, meals brought in on trays, letters written, letters read, long periods of thinking, which was perhaps the hardest part of all, because the Tower gave prisoners something they did not want. Time to think about mistakes, time to think about enemies, time to think about kings, and time to wonder whether they would ever leave those stone walls again. And as we continue drifting through these quiet halls, we'll soon see that for many prisoners, the hardest part was not the prison itself. It was simply not knowing how their story would end. Let's continue, slowly, through another quiet part of life inside the Tower of London, because not every prisoner spent their days in fear, chains, or darkness. In fact, for many prisoners, the hardest part of the tower was not pain, but time. There was simply too much of it. Days inside the tower often followed a very slow rhythm. Morning light would slip through narrow windows, thin and pale against the stone walls. Guards would change shifts. Doors would open and close. Meals would arrive at regular hours, and then nothing much would happen for a very long time for prisoners who were educated or noble. This meant reading, writing letters, praying, or simply walking in small circles around their rooms. Some prisoners were even allowed to walk in the tower gardens under supervision, which must have felt like a great luxury after staring at the same walls for weeks or months. Many prisoners wrote letters constantly. Letters to family, letters to friends, letters to the king, letters begging for forgiveness, letters explaining their innocence, letters trying to arrange marriages, money or favours. The tower was full of letters. Hopeful letters, angry letters, desperate letters, most of which changed nothing. Waiting became a way of life. Some prisoners did not know if they would be released next week, next year, or never. That uncertainty was often worse than a sentence. At least a sentence has an end date. The tower often did not. There are records of prisoners carving their names, coats of arms and messes into the stone walls. Even today, some of these carvings still exist. Names scratched slowly into rock by people who had nothing but time and worry. It was their way of saying, I was here. I existed. Do not forget me. And that is perhaps the strangest thing about the tower. Many of the most powerful people in England passed through those rooms at their worst moment. Kings locked up former friends. Queens imprisoned rivals. Brothers imprisoned brothers. Fathers imprisoned sons. Royal families, as we've seen many times, were not always very supportive of each other. Power in those days was very fragile. One wrong marriage, one bad alliance, one rumour, one accusation, and a person could go from living in a palace to living in the tower in a matter of days. And once inside, life slowed down to almost nothing. Slow footsteps, quiet meals, long thoughts, writing letters that might never be answered, listening to ravens outside, watching the sky through a narrow window, wondering what people were saying about you beyond the walls. The world moved on without you, which may have been the most difficult punishment of all, because inside the tower, time did not stop. It just moved, very slowly. Let's continue and step outside for a moment, into the tower yard where the air feels a little more open, and the silence is broken mostly by footsteps and birds, very famous birds. Actually, the Tower of London is well known for its ravens, and for centuries people have believed a very specific superstition. If the ravens ever leave the tower, the Kingdom of England will fall, which is a lot of responsibility to place on a few birds. But, naturally, the monarchy took this very seriously. The ravens were cared for, fed, and even had their wings slightly trimmed so they wouldn't fly too far away, which is, in a way, a very royal solution to a superstition. If the prophecy says the birds must stay, then the birds will stay. Prisoners in the tower would often see these ravens in the yard, hopping along the grass, watching everything with quiet interest. Ravens are very intelligent birds, and they are not easily frightened, so they would wander around the tower as if they owned the place. Imagine being a prisoner walking slowly along the wall under guard, and seeing a raven staring at you like it knew something you didn't, in a place already full of uncertainty and waiting. It probably didn't help morale very much. The tower was full of these small superstitions and quiet traditions. Guards had routines, prisoners had routines, and the place itself seemed to run on habits built over hundreds of years. Every morning, gates opened. Every night, gates closed. Guards walked the same paths. Prisoners waited in the same rooms. Ravens walked the same yards. Everything moved in slow repetition, day after day, year after year. For prisoners who stayed a long time, this routine became their entire world. They would learn the sounds of the tower, the sound of keys, the sound of boots on stone stairs, the sound of doors opening for meals, the sound of bells from the city outside the walls. These sounds became their clock, their calendar, their connection to a world they could not see. Some prisoners grew used to tower life. Not happy, exactly, but adjusted. Humans can adjust to almost anything if given enough time and no choice. New prisoners often arrived frightened, angry, or confused. But after months inside the tower, many became quiet, slow-moving, and patient. They learned that shouting changed nothing. Anger changed nothing. Only time moved things forward, and time moved very slowly here. And sometimes, after years of waiting, a door would open, and a guard would arrive with news. Sometimes the news was freedom. Sometimes the news was transfer. And sometimes the news was that their waiting was over, and their story would soon leave the tower walls for the final time. So the ravens continued to walk in the yard. The guards continued their slow patrols, and the tower continued doing what it had always done, waiting, just like its prisoners. Let's continue. Back inside the tower walls, into the quieter rooms, where prisoners spent long days with very little to do, except think, remember, and wait. Because when a person is given enough time and very little hope, they often feel the need to leave something behind. Some kind of proof that they existed, that they were more than just a name on a list of prisoners. And so, many prisoners in the Tower of London began carving messages into the stone walls. These carvings were not done quickly. Stone is slow to carve, and prisoners did not usually have proper tools. They used nails, knives, bits of metal, anything sharp enough to scratch into the surface. It would take hours, sometimes days, to carve a single name. Some carved their names. Some carved family symbols. Some carved prayers. Some carved long messages declaring innocence, or loyalty to the crown, or forgiveness for their enemies. And some simply carved the date, marking the slow passage of time that otherwise felt endless. If you walk through parts of the tower today, you can still see these carvings. Names from hundreds of years ago, scratched into the walls by people who were not sure if anyone would ever read them. It's a very quiet kind of history. Not battles, not kings, not crowns. Just names carved slowly into stone by people sitting alone in a room, wondering what would happen to them. Many prisoners also kept journals or wrote letters, though not all of those survived. Paper disappears much more easily than stone. But the carvings remained, and they tell us something very human about the tower. Most prisoners were not thinking about history. They were thinking about home, about family, about mistakes they had made, or mistakes they believed others had made. They thought about conversations they wished they had handled differently, people they trusted too much, letters they should not have written, alliances they should not have made. The tower was full of powerful people, but inside those walls, power did not matter very much anymore. Once the door closed, a duke, a queen, a bishop, or a general all had something in common. They were just people in a room, waiting for someone else to decide their future. And that waiting could last months. Or years. Imagine watching seasons change through a small window. Rain, then sun, then cold, then rain again. Hearing distant sounds from London bells, carts, crowds while your own world never really changed. That was life for many Tower prisoners. Not constant torture, not constant fear. Justuslo Hergarten, while the world outside continued to move. Faster and faster. Without you. And in that silence, people carved their names into stone, hoping that even if they disappeared, the walls would remember them. Talk about something that every prisoner in the tower thought about constantly. The day they would leave. Because everyone who entered the Tower of London eventually left. One way or another. But the problem was, no one knew which way it would be. For some prisoners, release came quietly. A guard would arrive in the morning, unlock the door, and simply say that the prisoner was free to go. No celebration. No apology. Just paperwork, orders, and the end of imprisonment as quietly as it had begun. Imagine walking out after years inside stone walls. The sky would look too big, the city too loud, too many people moving too quickly. Freedom, after a long imprisonment, probably felt very strange, almost uncomfortable at first. Some prisoners had lost everything while they were inside. Their titles, their land, their money, their friends, sometimes even their families. So leaving the tower did not always mean returning to a good life. Sometimes it meant starting over with nothing. But still, they were outside, and that was enough. Other prisoners did not leave through the main gates at all. Instead, they left through a place called Tower Hill, just outside the fortress walls, where executions were held publicly. One of the most famous prisoners to leave this way was Thomas Cromwell, a powerful advisor to Henry VIII. Cromwell had helped Henry become more powerful, helped him break from the Catholic Church, helped arrange royal marriages, and helped send many other people to prison or execution. And then, as often happened in Tudor politics, he fell out of favour. Very quickly, he went from being one of the most powerful men in England to being a prisoner in the Tower, the same place where many of his political enemies had gone before him. It is a very common pattern in history. People build systems of power, and eventually those same systems are used against them. Cromwell was executed in 1540, and like many Tower prisoners, his fall was fast. Power in Tudor England was like standing on ice. Everything looked stable, until suddenly it wasn't. For many prisoners, the most frightening part of the Tower was not the prison itself, but the uncertainty. Every time footsteps stopped outside their door, they probably wondered, is this release? Is this questioning? Is this the end? Living with that question every day. must have been exhausting. So life in the tower was mostly waiting. Waiting for a trial, waiting for a letter, waiting for a decision, waiting for freedom, or waiting for the end. The tower did not rush anything. It simply waited. And eventually, history decided for you. Let's continue slowly toward the later years of the tower, when it began to change from a place of fear into something quieter, almost like a memory made of stone, because the Tower of London was not always a prison forever. Over the centuries, its role slowly changed. Fewer political prisoners arrived. Fewer royal dramas ended behind its walls. England itself was changing, becoming more stable, more bureaucratic, less likely to solve political problems by quietly locking someone in a fortress, which, for many people, was probably an improvement. By the 1700s and 1800s, the tower was used less often as a prison for important political figures. Instead, it became more of a military storage site, an armory, and eventually a historical site. Tourists began visiting, walking through the same rooms where prisoners had once waited for their fate. Imagine that people casually walking through rooms where queens had cried, where nobles had written last letters, where prisoners had carved their names into stone, hoping not to be forgotten. History has a strange habit of turning very serious places into tourist destinations. But even as the tower changed, the stories remained. Guides told visitors about lost princes, Prius owner de queens, failed plots, and dramatic executions. The tower slowly transformed from a place of fear into a place of stories. And stories, in many ways, last longer than power. Kings who once controlled entire countries are now mostly remembered because something happened to them, or because they sent someone to the tower, or because they themselves ended up inside it. The prisoners became more famous than the kings who imprisoned them, which is a quiet kind of historical irony. Today, the tower is peaceful compared to its past. Visitors walk around taking photos, listening to guides, looking at the crown jewels, and watching the famous guards in their uniforms. Ravens still walk around the grounds. Still part of the old superstition that the kingdom will fall if they ever leave. But the tower no longer waits for prisoners. It waits for tourists. And yet, if you walk through the older rooms, especially the smaller ones with narrow windows and carved walls, you can still feel something. A kind of quiet heaviness. Not frightening, not dramatic. Just a sense that many people sat in those rooms for a very long time, thinking about their lives, their mistakes, their enemies, and their uncertain futures. The Tower of London was never just a prison. It was a place where power ended, a place where waiting became a way of life, a place where some people disappeared. Some people were forgiven, some people escaped, and some people became legends. And for hundreds of years, behind those thick stone walls, the most powerful people in England learned a very simple and very uncomfortable truth. Power can disappear very quickly. But the tower was always waiting. Let's continue. But this time, instead of prisoners, let's talk about the people who were always there. The ones who never left the tower. Sick guards. Because while prisoners came and went, the guards of the spent their entire working lives inside those walls. They saw kings rise and fall, Queens arrive in boats and leave in coffins. Nobles panic, priests pray, and prisoners wait, sometimes for years. The guards were known as yeoman warders, and today people often call them beefeaters. They are famous now for their uniforms and for guiding tourists. But in the past, their job was very serious. They guarded prisoners, escorted them to trials, escorted them to executions, and made sure no one escaped unless someone very important had ordered it. Imagine doing the same job for years, walking the same stone corridors, carrying keys, opening the same heavy doors, watching prisoners arrive frightened, angry, or confused. The guards saw people at the worst moments of their lives. They saw powerful men who used to command armies suddenly become quiet and polite. They saw nobles who once lived in huge palaces now asking for extra blankets. They saw prisoners try to act brave, try to act calm, try to pretend everything would be fine. The guards probably knew, long before the prisoners did, how most stories would end. And yet, life for the guards was also routine. Lock doors in the evening, unlock doors in the morning, deliver meals, escort prisoners for walks, check windows, walk the walls at night, listen to the wind, the ravens, and the distant noise of London outside. The tower at night must have felt very different. Qui est corridor? Torches or candles flickering against stone walls. The sound of boots echoing on stairs. Maybe a prisoner awake late, writing a letter. Maybe someone praying quietly. Maybe someone unable to sleep, knowing tomorrow would change everything. The guards walked through all of this like part of the building itself. Always there. Always watching. Always carrying keys. There is something very symbolic about keys in the tower. Keys meant control. Keys meant freedom or imprisonment. The person with the keys decided when doors opened and when they stayed closed. Prisoners waited for the sound of keys more than anything else. Keys meant news, movement, change, or sometimes just another meal and another day of waiting. Even today, the tower still has a ceremony of the keys every night, a tradition that has happened for hundreds of years. Every night, the gates are locked in a formal ceremony, just as they were when the tower held prisoners. The prisoners are gone now, but every night, the keys still turn in the locks, just like they always have. Talk about something many prisoners must have thought about often. Their last night in the tower. Not everyone knew when that night would be. Some prisoners were released suddenly. Some were moved without warning. And some were told, very clearly, that tomorrow would be their final day. Imagine being told that you had one night left inside the Tower of London. One last evening in a stone room. One last candle burning slowly. One last time hearing the guards walking in the corridor. One last time looking out of a narrow window at the sky above London. Many prisoners spent their last night writing letters. Letters to wives, husbands, children, friends. Letters asking for forgiveness. Letters forgiving others. Letters explaining their side of the story. Letters trying to make sure their families would be taken care of. Some prayed all night. Some talked with priests. Some slept surprisingly well, perhaps because there was nothing left to worry about anymore. When uncertainty disappears, even if the outcome is bad, the mind sometimes becomes very calm. Others could not sleep at all. They walked their small rooms, sat down, stood up again, looked out the window, listened to every sound. thinking about their entire life all at once. Many Tower prisoners had once lived in palaces, eaten huge feasts, worn fine clothes, and commanded servants. And now their last night was in a small stone room with a table, a bed, a candle, and silence. Power disappears very quietly sometimes. In the morning, a guard would arrive early. The door would open. The prisoner would be escorted out, often very calmly. There were no dramatic struggles in most cases. People understood that resistance would change nothing. For executions inside the Tower, the scaffold was usually prepared on Tower Green. It was a private execution, area used for very important prisoners, like queens or high nobles, so the execution would not become a huge public spectacle. One of the most famous people executed inside the Tower was Anne Boleyn. She had once lived in palaces, attended grand celebrations, and been one of the most powerful women in England. And then, after political accusations and royal decisions, she spent her last days in the Tower. Her execution was private, quiet, and very controlled. Not a huge crowd, not a public show. Just officials, guards, and a few witnesses. Her story, like many others connected to the Tower, ended not with chaos, but with silence. And that silence is really the story of the Tower of London. Not constant screaming, not endless torture, not dramatic battles, just doors opening and closing, footsteps in corridors, letters written by candlelight, ravens in the yard, guards carrying keys, and prisoners waiting, wondering, and eventually leaving, one way or another. Let's go back to the beginning again, to the moment most prisoners first arrived at the Tower of London, because first impressions matter, and the Tower was very good at first impressions. Many important prisoners did not arrive by road. They arrived by boat, travelling along the River Thames. This was partly for security, partly for privacy, and partly for symbolism. Being brought by river felt official, controlled, unavoidable. The boat would move slowly through the water, the Tower growing larger ahead, its stone walls rising above the river. London would be noisy behind their markets, carts, people. Bells but the closer the boat got to the Tower, the quieter things probably felt for the prisoner, because they knew where they were going. Most prisoners entered through a water entrance known as Traitors Gate. It is a dark stone archway that opens directly onto the river, allowing boats to pass underneath the Tower walls. Even the name alone would make the situation feel worse. Imagine sitting in a boat, passing under that gate, knowing that many famous prisoners had entered the same way, and many of them never walked out again. Once inside, the prisoner would be escorted through corridors and up stone staircases to their room. Some rooms were large and comfortable. Others were small and cold. The difference depended entirely on who you were, how important you were, and how angry the king or queen was at you. Some prisoners were allowed servants, books, writing materials, and decent food. Others were given very little. The Tower was not one single prison. It was more like a collection of different prisons inside one fortress. The first night was probably the hardest for most prisoners. Everything was unfamiliar. The bed felt strange. The room was cold. The sounds were different guards walking, doors closing, wind moving around the stone walls, ravens outside, And most of all, there was uncertainty. New prisoners often believed their situation would be temporary. They thought there had been a misunderstanding, that someone would explain things, that a letter would arrive, that the king would forgive them, that everything would return to normal. Sometimes they were right. Often they were wrong. Days would pass, then weeks, then months. The Tower had a way of turning short stays into long ones. Politics moved slowly, and prisoners simply had to wait while powerful people made decisions far away from the stone rooms, where those decisions mattered most. After a while, prisoners developed routines. Wake up, eat, walk if allowed, write letters, read, pray, think, sleep, repeat. Days blended together until it was difficult to remember what day it was, or sometimes even what month it was. Life became very small inside the Tower. One room. Van wind, afwipe. The same walls every day. But outside those walls, England continued to change. Kings made decisions. Wars started and ended. People were born, people died, cities grew, and the world moved forward. Inside the Tower, time moved much more slowly, and every prisoner, sooner or later, realized something very important. The Tower was not just a prison. It was a place where the rest of your life stopped and waited for you. As strange as it sounds, the Tower of London was not always just a prison. Sometimes it was also a royal residence, which meant that, in certain periods, a king might be living in one part of the Tower, while a political prisoner was locked in another part. One person sleeping in a comfortable royal chamber, another sleeping in a cold stone room, all inside the same walls. History is full of these strange situations. In earlier centuries, before London had many large palaces, English kings actually used the Tower as a place to stay when they were in the city. It was safe, heavily guarded, and symbolized royal power. Living inside a giant fortress sent a very clear message. The king was in control. But this also meant the Tower had comfortable apartments, kitchens, storage rooms, chapels, and even gardens. So, when important prisoners were held there, they sometimes stayed in surprisingly comfortable conditions. If you were a high-ranking noble, a foreign prince, or an important political prisoner, you might have your own room. Servants, decent food, wine, books, and permission to walk in certain areas. You were still a prisoner, of course, but a prisoner with a chair, a desk, and perhaps a fireplace. It was a very medieval idea of imprisonment. You were not always punished physically. You were simply kept somewhere where you could not interfere with politics anymore. Many kings used the Tower this way. Instead of executing every rival, they would just lock them in the Tower for a few years. It was safer, quieter, and sometimes politically smarter. Dead rivals can become martyrs. Living prisoners are easier to control. But this system also created a strange situation, where the Tower was full of important people who were all, in some way, connected to power. Dukes, bishops, generals, queens, princes, all waiting inside the same fortress at different times. The Tower was almost like a storage room for political problems. Someone becomes inconvenient. Send them to the Tower. Someone might start a rebellion. Send them to the Tower. Someone married the wrong person, supported the wrong king, believed the wrong religion, or simply annoyed the wrong royal advisor. Send them to the Tower. It solved many problems very quickly, and for the prisoners, life became a long period of waiting, hoping that the political situation outside would change. Sometimes a new king would come to power and release prisoners from the previous reign. Sometimes prisoners were forgotten and stayed for years. Sometimes they were suddenly executed because the political situation changed again. So inside the Tower, prisoners followed politics very closely. News from outside was extremely important. A war, a rebellion, a royal marriage, the death of a king, any of these events could suddenly change a prisoner's fate overnight. Imagine living in a place where your future depended entirely on events you could not see and could not control. That was life in the Tower. You waited while history decided what to do with you. One of the strangest things about the Tower of London is that many of the people sent there were not always enemies of the king. Very often, they were former friends. Royal courts were full of alliances, friendships, marriages, and political partnerships. People worked together for years, helped each other gain power, supported each other in wars and politics. And then, very suddenly, everything could change. A disagreement, or rumour, a failed marriage alliance, supporting the wrong royal heir, believing the wrong religion at the wrong time. In Tudor England, especially, religion and politics were extremely dangerous topics. One king wanted the country Catholic. The next wanted it Protestant. The next wanted something slightly different again. And every change created new prisoners. So it was not unusual for someone to visit the Tower one year as a royal advisor and return a few years later as a prisoner. This happened again and again in English history. The Tower was full of people who once had dinner with the king, gave him advice, fought in his wars, helped him gain power, and later found themselves locked behind stone walls because the political situation changed. Power was very unstable. Being close to the king was the most powerful position you could have, and also the most dangerous. If the king trusted you, you could become rich and powerful. But if the king stopped trusting you, you could lose everything very quickly. And when they fell fast. One day they were living in huge houses, wearing expensive clothes, giving orders to servants and soldiers. The next day they were travelling by boat to the Tower, passing under Traitors Gate, and realising their life had completely changed. Inside the Tower, many prisoners probably spent a lot of time thinking about the same question. When did everything go wrong? Was it a conversation, a letter, a marriage, a political decision, trusting the wrong person, saying the wrong thing in front of the wrong noble? History often changes because of very small moments that seemed unimportant at the time. And in the Tower, prisoners had plenty of time to replay those moments in their minds. They would think about old friends who had disappeared from court, friends who had stopped writing letters, friends who had joined the king's side instead of theirs. Royal courts were not very safe places for friendship. Loyalty often lasted only as long as it was politically useful. So the Tower became full of former friends, former advisors, and former favourites of the king. The Tower was not just a prison for criminals. It was a prison for people who had once been very important, and then suddenly were not. And that may be the most important thing to understand about the Tower of London. Most prisoners were not there because they were poor or unknown. They were there because they had once been powerful. And power is a very dangerous thing to lose. Let's continue. Because if there is one group of people that appears again and again in the story of the Tower of London, it is royal families. And royal families, as history repeatedly shows us, were often extremely dangerous places to be born. We often imagine being a prince or princess as a very comfortable life palaces. Servants, expensive clothes, big feast, and people bowing when you walk into a room. And yes, those things were real. But so were rivalries, succession crises, political marriages, and relatives who might imprison you if you were too close to the throne. In many royal families, brothers were rivals, cousins were political threats, and uncles sometimes imprisoned nephews. The closer you were to the crown, the more dangerous your life could become. The Tower was full of royal relatives who were considered potential problems. They had done nothing wrong, but they had royal blood, and that alone made them dangerous in the eyes of the king or queen. If a king died and there were multiple possible heirs, things could become very complicated very quickly. Nobles would choose sides, families would argue, armies might get involved. And sometimes the easiest solution for the new ruler was simply to lock the other claimants in the tower. It was a very permanent way to solve political uncertainty. Many princes spent parts of their childhood in the tower, not because they were criminals, but because they were important. Keeping them in the tower meant they could not be used by rebels who wanted to replace the king. So for some royal children, the tower was not just a prison. It was part of their childhood. Imagine growing up in a fortress, surrounded by guards, not allowed to leave. While outside the walls, people argued about whether you should become king someday. It must have been a very strange life. Royal marriages also caused many tower imprisonments. Kings married for alliances, power, or money, not for love. And if a marriage did not produce a son, or if political alliances changed, or if the king simply changed his mind, the queen's position could become very dangerous. We have already talked about queens like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who both went from palace life to the tower very quickly. Their stories were not unusual. Royal marriage was often less about romance and more about politics. And when politics changed, marriages could end very badly. So the tower became deeply connected to royal family problems. Arguments over who should rule. Marriages that went wrong, relatives who were too popular, heirs who were too young, or cousins who had supporters. The tower was, in many ways, a solution to royal family arguments. Not a peaceful solution, but a very effective one. And for centuries, whenever there was a problem in the royal family, someone often ended up inside those stone walls, waiting for history to decide what would happen next. Every prisoner in the Tower of London was waiting for execution or permanent imprisonment. Many were waiting for something else. Or pardon. A royal pardon was one of the most powerful documents in England. A single decision by the king or queen could open a prison door, restore land and titles, and completely change a person's future in a single day. So many prisoners spent their time in the tower writing letters. Lots of letters. They wrote to the king. They wrote to the queen. They wrote to royal advisors, powerful nobles, bishops, generals, and anyone else who might speak on their behalf. They asked for forgiveness, explained their actions, blamed misunderstandings, blamed other people, promised loyalty, promised obedience, promised they had learned their lesson. The Tower was full of people trying to apologize their way back into royal favour. Some prisoners were very good at this. They understood politics, knew who to contact, knew which noble owed them a favour, knew which royal advisor could influence the king. They treated imprisonment like a political problem that needed to be solved slowly and carefully. Others were less skilled. They wrote angry letters, refused to apologize, or insisted they had done nothing wrong. This was not usually a successful strategy when the person deciding your fate was the king. So, inside the Tower, prisoners waited for letters almost more than they waited for food. Every time a guard brought papers or messages, it could mean everything had changed. A pardon, a reduced sentence, a transfer, a trial, or bad news. Letters were the only connection prisoners had to the outside world of politics and power. Sometimes pardons came after a new king or queen took the throne. New rulers often released prisoners from the previous reign, especially if those prisoners had been enemies of the old king. So, when a king died, prisoners in the Tower might suddenly become very hopeful. A king's death could open prison doors, but it could also close them, depending on which side you had supported. So, prisoners followed news about the royal family very closely. Births, deaths, marriages, wars, rebellions. Every piece of news mattered to someone inside the Tower. In a strange way, the Tower was full of people whose lives depended entirely on events happening somewhere else. They could not fight wars, could not attend court, could not speak to the king directly, could not defend themselves in person. They could only write letters, wait, and hope someone outside remembered them. And sometimes people were forgotten. Years passed. Kings changed. Wars ended. New problems appeared. And somewhere in the Tower, a prisoner might still be sitting in a room, writing letters that fewer and fewer people cared about. Being forgotten was probably one of the worst fates in the Tower. Not cute, not released, just slowly forgotten. While the world moved on without you, let's continue. Because something very strange sometimes happened to long-term prisoners in the Tower of London. After enough time, prison started to feel normal. This is something historians have noticed in letters and records from long-term prisoners. At the beginning, prisoners wrote desperate letters, constantly asked for release, complained about conditions, and tried to contact anyone who might help them. But after many years, the tone of their letters often changed. They began writing about everyday things, their health, the weather, books they were reading, arguments with guards, requests for better food, warmer blankets, or permission to walk outside. Life became smaller, quieter, and focused on very ordinary problems. When a person lives in the same place 4 years, even a prison becomes familiar. They learn the routines, the guards' personalities. The times meals arrive, when the bells ring in the city, when the ravens appear in the yard. Some prisoners were even allowed to have pets, books, writing desks, and sometimes servants if they were important enough. Their rooms slowly filled with small personal items, making the rooms feel less like prison cells and more like very small homes. There were prisoners who spent so long in the tower that when they were finally released, they did not know what to do with their freedom. The outside world had changed. Friends had died. Money was gone. Politics had moved on. They had spent so long waiting that they had forgotten how to live normally. In a strange way, the tower became their world. They knew every wall, every stair, every window view. They knew the guards by name. They knew the daily routine. Outside the tower, everything was uncertain and new again. Inside the tower, life was predictable. Predictable, but not free. And that is an important difference. Humans can get used to almost any routine, but that does not mean they are happy. It just means they have learned how to survive in that situation. Many long-term prisoners created very strict daily routines to keep their minds healthy. Wake up at the same time, pray, read, write letters, walk if allowed, study, eat, write again, sleep, repeat, routine, gave structure to a life that otherwise had no clear future. Without routine, days would blur together and time would disappear completely. So life in the tower was often quiet, repetitive, and slow. Not constant suffering, but constant waiting, constant uncertainty, and a slow adjustment to a life that no one had planned to live. And perhaps the strangest part of all, some prisoners walked out of the tower after many years and almost missed it. Not because they loved prison, but because it had become the only life they knew. Night inside, though, was very different from the daytime. During the day, there were footsteps, guards changing shifts, doors opening and closing, voices in corridors, sometimes visitors, sometimes officials. But at night, the tower became very quiet. Stone buildings hold silence in a strange way. Small sounds travel very far. A single door closing somewhere in the fortress might echo through multiple corridors. Footsteps on a spiral staircase could be heard from rooms above and below. The wind moving along the walls could sound like distant whispers. For prisoners, night was probably the hardest time. During the day, there were distractions, letters to write, books to read, prayers, conversations with guards, short walks, meals. But at night, there was nothing to do except lie in bed and think. And thinking was often the most difficult part of imprisonment. Many prisoners probably thought about their past, the decisions that led them here, the people they trusted, the enemies they made, the king or queen who had signed the order for their imprisonment. They would think about their families, their homes, their old life, and wonder if they would ever see those things again. Some prisoners were afraid at night because executions often happened early in the morning. If guards came for a prisoner before sunrise, it usually meant very bad news. So if someone heard footsteps stopping outside their door in the early morning hours, their heart probably started beating very fast. The sound of keys was one of the most important sounds in the tower. Keys meant movement. Keys meant doors opening. Keys meant news. A prisoner could tell a lot just from the way a guard used the keys fast. Slow, many doors. One door, early morning, late night. Guards also walked the walls at night, watching the city and the river. London, at night in medieval and Tudor. Times was much darker and quieter than modern cities. No electric lights, very few street lamps. Mostly darkness, with a few candles and fires visible through windows. From the tower walls, guards and prisoners might see small lights across the river, hear distant voices, dogs barking, bells ringing from churches, or boats moving slowly on the Thames. The outside world was very close, but completely unreachable. That might have been one of the hardest things about the tower. Prisoners could see London. They could hear London. They knew life was continuing just outside the walls. People were working, eating, laughing, arguing, getting married, having children, travelling, living normal lives. And they were stuck in the same rooms, day after day, night after night. The tower was not far away from the city, but for prisoners, it might as well have been another world. After a few weeks in the Tower of London, a prisoner still believed something would happen soon. After a few months, they hoped something would happen eventually. But after a few years, many prisoners began to realize something much worse than execution or punishment. They had been forgotten. Not officially, of course. Their names were still written in records somewhere. Guards still brought food. Doors were still locked every night. But politically, socially, and personally, they slowly disappeared from the world outside. At royal courts, new advisors replaced old ones. New favourites became powerful. New alliances were formed. New wars started. New marriages were arranged. And the people who had once been important slowly stopped being mentioned. This was very common in royal politics. Power moved quickly, and people who lost power were often erased from political life completely. Being in the tower made it very easy for people outside to pretend you no longer mattered. Friends stopped writing letters because writing to a prisoner could be politically dangerous. Family members sometimes stopped visiting because they did not want to anger the king. Servants found new masters. Houses were sold. Lands were given to someone else. Life outside the tower continued to move forward, slowly removing the prisoner from the world they once knew. Inside the tower, however, time felt frozen. The same walls, the same door, the same window, the same routine, the same guards. Days, months, and years began to feel very similar. Prisoners sometimes mark days on walls or in books just to keep track of time. Because without some kind of record, it would be easy to lose track of years completely. Imagine trying to remember what you did 3 years ago. But every day looked almost exactly the same. Memory would become very confusing. Days would blur together into one long, quiet period of waiting. Some prisoners were eventually released after very long imprisonments, sometimes 10, 15, or even 20 years. When they left, they were older, poorer, and often completely unknown to the younger generation outside the tower. They had once been important figures in politics, but now they were just former prisoners. History moved on without them. This is one of the quiet tragedies of the Tower of London. Not all prisoners were executed. Not all prisoners escaped. Many simply disappeared from history while still alive, sitting in a room, writing letters that fewer and fewer people answered. The tower did not always end lives quickly. Sometimes it erased people slowly. For the prisoners who were eventually released from the Tower of London, freedom did not always feel the way they had imagined it would. Many prisoners spent years dreaming about the day. The door would open and they would be told they could leave. They imagined walking through London again, seeing family eating at large table, sleeping in comfortable beds, travelling, talking freely, and living the life they once had. But after many years inside the tower, reality was often very different. The world had changed while they were gone. Kings had died. New kings had taken the throne. Laws had changed. Religions had changed. Friends had died or moved away. Children had grown up without them. Servants had found new masters. Houses had new owners. Land had been given to someone else. Money was often gone. Some former prisoners walked out of the tower and realized they had nowhere to go. Others were technically free but still not trusted by the king, which meant they could not return to court, could not hold important jobs, and could not regain their old power. They were free, but their old life was gone forever. Freedom without power was very different from the life they remembered. Some prisoners were even placed under house arrest after leaving the tower, meaning they were free to live in a house, but not allowed to travel or leave a certain area. So, even after leaving the tower, they were still not completely free. There are records of former prisoners who struggled to adjust to normal life again, after years of living in 1 or 2 rooms with a strict routine. The outside world felt loud, fast, and confusing. Too many people, too many choices, too much movement. Inside the tower, life was simple. Wake up, eat, read, write, walk, sleep. Outside the tower, life was unpredictable again. Some former prisoners tried to return to politics, but this was very dangerous. If they became too powerful again, they might be accused of treason again and sent back to the tower. And this did happen to some people. They left the tower, returned to political life, lost power again, and came back as prisoners again. The tower was not always a one-time experience. For some unlucky nobles, it became a place they visited more than once in their lifetime. Usually, whenever the political situation changed, and they were on the wrong side of power again. So, leaving the tower did not always mean the story was over. Sometimes it just meant a new chapter had begun. And if politics went badly again, that chapter might end back inside the same stone walls, with the same guards, the same doors, and the same long, quiet days of waiting. The Tower of London has a strange kind of patience. Kings came and went, queens rose and fell. Nobles gained power and lost everything. Prisoners arrived in fear and left in silence. But the tower itself stayed exactly where it was, watching all of it. This is something easy to forget when talking about history. The people in history believed their problems were the most important things in the world. Their wars, their marriages, their arguments, their alliances, their betrayals, all of it felt incredibly important at the time. But the tower saw all of them come and go. A powerful minister would arrive in a boat, accused of treason, terrified about his future. A few years later, a different minister would arrive for the same reason. Then our noble, now bishop, then our queen, then our prince. Different names, different stories, but very similar endings. The tower must have felt like a place where the same story happened again and again, just with different people. Powerful person becomes important. Powerful person makes enemies. Something goes wrong. Powerful person is arrested. Boat ride on the river. Traitors Gate. Starn room. Waiting. letters, hope, fear, decision, release, or execution, or years of silence. Then the next person arrives, and the whole story repeats. If stone walls could remember, the tower would have thousands of stories that are almost the same. The details change, but the pattern stays the same. That is one of the most interesting things about history. People change, but human behavior does not change very much. Ambition, jealousy, loyalty, betrayal, fear. Hope, these things appear in every century, in every royal court, in every government, and for many centuries in England. When those emotions caused political problems, the solution was often very simple. Send someone to the Tower. The Tower did not choose its prisoners. Kings and queens did that. The Tower just held them, quietly, patiently, without caring whether they were innocent or guilty, loyal or rebellious, kind or cruel. Everyone was the same once the door closed. A prisoner in a stone room, waiting for someone else to decide their future. And over hundreds of years. The Tower outlived almost everyone who ever walked through its gates. Kings died. Queens died. Ministers were executed. Princes disappeared. Nobles were forgotten. But the Tower was still there. Still by the river. Still behind its walls. Still waiting, just in case history needed it again. Today, the Tower of London is full of visitors almost every day. People walk through the gates with cameras, listen to guides, look at the crown jewels, and take photos of the famous ravens walking across the grass. It is a very different place from what it was hundreds of years ago. But the buildings are the same. The same stone walls. The same narrow windows. The same courtyards. The same towers where prisoners once slept. Waited, wrote letters, and wondered what would happen to them. Tourists now walk through rooms where prisoners once spent years of their lives. They stand in places where important historical figures once stood on the worst days of their lives. They look at carvings on the walls made by prisoners hundreds of years ago, names scratched slowly into stone by people who were not sure anyone would remember them. And in a strange way, we do remember them. Many of the kings who sent people to the Tower are less famous today than the prisoners themselves. People remember the princes who disappeared, the queens who were executed, the prisoners who escaped, the nobles who wrote letters from their cells. The Tower, which was meant to silence people and remove them from history, actually helped make many of them famous forever. That is one of history's quiet jokes. The place that was meant to erase people helped make them unforgettable. When visitors walk through the Tower today, they often talk quietly, even if they don't realize why. Old stone buildings often make people speak softly. Maybe it's the echo, maybe it's the atmosphere, or maybe it's just the feeling that many people lived important moments of their lives in those rooms. If you stand in one of the smaller rooms and look at the walls, you might see carved names, symbols, or dates. Those carvings were made slowly by prisoners with too much time and too many thoughts. They did not know that hundreds of years later, people from all over the world would come to look at those walls. They were just trying to leave proof that they existed. The Tower of London is no longer a prison, but it is still full of stories. Not loud stories, not dramatic stories, but quiet stories about waiting, power, fear, hope, and time. And maybe that is why the tower is still so interesting today. Because it is not just a castle, not just a prison, not just a museum. It is a place where, for hundreds of years, people waited to find out how their story would end. One of the most interesting things about the prisoners of the Tower of London is that most of them never expected to end up there. Very few people in history wake up in the morning and think, one day I will probably be imprisoned in a fortress by the king. Most prisoners believed they were loyal, careful, politically smart, or protected by powerful friends. Many believed imprisonment was something that happened to other people. But the tower was full of people who were surprised to be there. Royal advisors who thought they were trusted. Nobles who believed their family connections would protect them. Bishops who believed the king needed them. Generals who had won wars and thought that made them safe. Queens who believed marriage to the king guaranteed security. Again and again, history shows that proximity to power was not safety. In many cases the opposite. The closer you were to the king, the more dangerous your life could become. Kings and queens worried constantly about rebellion, betrayal, rival claims to the throne, and political enemies. If a ruler began to suspect someone, even without strong proof, it was often safer for the ruler to imprison that person first and ask questions later. The tower was, in many ways, a prison for the important and the dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of criminals, but dangerous in the sense of politics. A popular noble could be dangerous. A royal cousin could be dangerous. A religious leader could be dangerous. A general with loyal soldiers could be dangerous. Even a queen could be dangerous if she might support the wrong political faction. So the tower filled up with people who were important enough to be a threat, but not important enough to be completely safe. Many prisoners probably spent their first days in the tower in complete disbelief. They had attended royal dinners, advised the king, owned huge houses, commanded soldiers, or married into powerful families. And now they were sitting in a stone room with a guard outside the door. It must have felt unreal. Some prisoners believed they would be released quickly because there had been a misunderstanding. Some believed their friends would help them. Some believed the king would forgive them. Some believed the accusations would be proven false. Sometimes they were right. Many times were not. The tower was full of people who thought their story would end one way, and then history decided it would end another way. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of the Tower of London. In a world of kings and queens, power looked very strong, but it was often very fragile. And sometimes the most powerful people in the country ended up in the quietest rooms, behind the thickest walls, waiting for someone else to decide their fate. Over the centuries, the Tower of London quietly taught the same lesson to everyone who entered its gates, whether they were a noble, a queen, a soldier, a priest, or a royal advisor. Power does not last forever. Many prisoners arrived at the tower after living very comfortable and powerful lives. They were used to giving orders, not receiving them. They were used to large rooms, not small ones. They were used to servants opening doors, not guards locking them. The tower changed all of that very quickly. Once inside, titles did not matter very much anymore. Dukes, earls, bishops, generals, and royal relatives all eventually lived very similar lives inside the tower. They waited for meals, waited for news, waited for letters, waited for guards to unlock doors. waited for decisions made by people far away. Waiting was the great equalizer of the tower. A man who once commanded thousands of soldiers might now spend his day waiting for permission to take a short walk. A woman who once attended royal banquets might now spend her evening writing letters by candlelight in a small room. A noble who once owned huge estates might now worry about whether his blanket was warm enough in winter. The tower reduced powerful people to very simple lives. Wake up, eat, wait, walk if allowed, write letters, read, think, sleep, repeat. Days became simple, slow, and quiet. And during those long, quiet days, many prisoners probably had a lot of time to think about their lives, about ambition, loyalty, trust, mistakes, and the strange way politics worked. Some prisoners wrote books, poems, or long letters that historians still read today, which means that, in a strange way, imprisonment helped preserve their thoughts for the future. If some of those prisoners had never been sent to the tower, we might not remember them today. The tower was meant to remove people from history, but sometimes it did the opposite. It gave them time to write, think, and leave records behind. So the tower became not just a prison, but also a place where history was written. Letters, diaries, poems, religious writings, political arguments, all written by people who had nothing but time and something very important to think about: their own life and how it had brought them to that room. And after hundreds of years of prisoners coming and going, the tower remained what it had always been: a place of waiting, a place where powerful people learned they were not as powerful as they thought, a place where doors closed slowly, time moved slowly, and history decided everything, very slowly. Beside the Tower of London flows the River Thames, and that river may have been one of the most difficult things for prisoners to see every day, because the river never stopped moving. Water flowed past the tower constantly, day and night, winter and summer, year after year. Boats moved along the river carrying food, wood, cloth, soldiers, merchants, letters, news, and people living their normal lives. The city continued to function. Trade continued, families continued to grow, and the world continued to move forward. But inside the tower, life stood still. Prisoners could sometimes see the river from windows or from the walls. If they were allowed to walk there under guard, they could watch boats pass by, watch the water move, watch birds fly over the river, and see London on the other side continuing with its daily life. It must have been a strange feeling to watch the world moving, while your own life felt paused. The river was also how many prisoners arrived. Boats passed under Traitors Gate, entering the tower directly from the water. So every time prisoners saw a boat approaching that gate, they probably knew another prisoner was arriving, beginning the same slow experience they had already been living. New prisoners arrived frightened, confused, angry, or quiet. Old prisoners watched them arrive and probably remembered their own first day, when everything felt unreal and temporary. Over time, prisoners would see guards change, rulers change, and sometimes even other prisoners leave while they remained. The river kept moving, the city kept growing, but their room stayed the same. There is something very symbolic about a prison next to a river. The river represents time moving forward, always moving, never stopping. The tower represented time standing still. For the people inside the tower, days were long and slow, but years passed quickly. Someone could enter the tower as a young man and leave as an old man. Someone could enter as a queen and leave as a prisoner with no title. Someone could enter as a powerful advisor and leave completely forgotten. Meanwhile, the river outside would look almost exactly the same as it did the day they arrived. Water moving past stone walls that never moved. Time moving past people who could not move. And in that way, the Tower of London was not just a prison building. It was a place where people sat still, while time flowed past them like a river they could see, but never touch. The Tower of London is famous not only for its walls, keys, and prisoners, but also for the birds that live there, the ravens. Legends say that if the ravens ever leave the tower, the kingdom will fall. This story may be partly superstition, partly tradition, but for centuries, the birds have been part of the tower's life. Ravens were not always just symbols. They watched the world from the battlements, perched on stone walls, moving across courtyards. For prisoners, the birds were probably one of the few living things they could see regularly. Guards fed them, and prisoners might have seen them moving around the grounds during walks. The presence of the ravens was a constant reminder of history moving slowly, in a way that humans often cannot control. Kings came and went. Prisoners arrived and left or didn't leave, but the ravens stayed. They saw generations of humans live and die, suffer and triumph, hope and despair, and they themselves remained mostly unchanged. Guards, too, were essential to the life of the tower. Yeoman warders, or beefeaters, carried keys, walked the walls, checked on prisoners, and preserved the order that made the tower function. They were witnesses to countless personal dramas, political shifts, and historical moments. A prisoner could not escape their attention. A visitor could not ignore their presence. For centuries, the guards were a bridge between the past and the present. They witnessed prisoners suffering, heard whispered confessions, delivered letters, and sometimes escorted individuals to their final moments. Some guards served for decades, and in that time, they saw the same walls hold the same stories, with only the names and faces changing. Ravens and guards alike observed history without taking part in it. They watched power, ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and fear play out in the same spaces over and over. Prisoners may have thought the tower was the centre of their world, but in reality, it was only the setting for countless stories. With the stone walls, the keys, and the birds as silent, patient witnesses. Those silent witnesses remind us that history is both personal and impersonal. Individual lives are fleeting. Decisions are temporary. Power is fragile. But the place that holds it, the stone walls, the courtyards, the birds, the keys persists, quietly, endlessly, patiently waiting for the next story to unfold. In that way, the tower is more than a fortress or a prison. It is a repository of human experience, the fears, hopes, mistakes, and waiting that countless people endured over centuries. And even now, it stands as a quiet monument to all of that, waiting for visitors, historians, and dreamers to remember and perhaps understand just a fraction of what life inside those walls was like. Inside the Tower of London, the stone walls do more than hold people, they hold timer. Centuries of waiting, plotting, praying, writing, hoping, and fearing have all been pressed into the very structure of the fortress. Each room, each corridor, each narrow window has witnessed countless lives unfolding and ending in its shadow. The silence of the tower is different from ordinary silence. It is heavy and patient. It does not rush or panic. It simply observes. Prisoners who lived there for months or years. Wold notice the subtle shifts in that silence. A door closing in the next corridor. Footsteps echoing down a spiral staircase. The faint rush of the Thames outside. Over time, the small sounds became the only markers of life in an otherwise frozen world. The prisoners themselves became part of the tower's weight. Their routines, their letters, their prayers, their whispered conversations all left traces. Some carved their names or symbols into the walls, leaving behind proof of existence. Others left records in journals or letters that survived centuries, giving modern readers a glimpse into the slow, quiet suffering and hope that defined tower life. Life inside the tower was defined by repetition, wake, eat, wait, walk, write, sleep, repeat. Days bled together. Nights were long and quiet. Hope was a fragile, carefully tended thing. Fear was a constant companion, though sometimes it wore itself down until it was simply a low hum in the background of daily life. Yet, for all its weight, the tower also taught patience. It showed that life could continue, slowly and methodically, even when choices were taken away, even when power, wealth, and influence vanished. The tower allowed time to flow in its own way. Some prisoners emerged after years, changed beyond recognition, shaped not by freedom, but by the endless rhythm of confinement. The tower never judged. It never cried, laughed, or wept. It simply remained, holding history, holding people, holding the slow unfolding of countless human stories. And in that way, it offers one of the quietest, most profound lessons history can teach. That life, even when paused, continues. That waiting, even when endless, shapes the mind. And that every person, no matter how powerful, eventually becomes part of something far larger and longer lasting than themselves. So, when walking through the tower today, it is worth listening carefully not for the words of guides or the laughter of tourists, but for the echoes of those who waited before, the silence of stone and the persistent, patient heartbeat of history itself. Time inside the Tower of London moved differently for prisoners than it did outside. Days, weeks, and months often felt like years, and years sometimes blurred together into a single, indistinct stretch of waiting. This is the quietest kind of suffering, not pain from injury, not hunger or cold, but the slow erosion of expectation and certainty. Prisoners had to occupy their minds, or risk losing themselves entirely. Many turned to books, if they were allowed, reading and rereading the same passages until every word became familiar. Others wrote letters that were never sent, documenting their lives, their fears, their regrets, and the strange minutiae of daily existence. Prayer was another companion-long, repetitive, and patient-offering structure in a life stripped of freedom. Some developed routines to preserve sanity, rising at a certain hour, pacing the small rooms, observing the guards and the subtle changes in light through the windows. Every predictable movement became a point of stability. A prisoner could know the exact timing of a guard's patrol or the delivery of meals, and in those small certainties, found a fragment of control over a life that was otherwise entirely dictated by others. But even routine could not fully shield the mind. The walls themselves, heavy and silent, pressed in on thoughts. Prisoners replayed conversations, political decisions, alliances, betrayals, and mistakes endlessly. They imagined futures that might never come, or feared decisions that were already made without their input. Sleep could become restless, with dreams haunted by past actions and imagined judgments. And yet, some developed a strange form of acceptance, a resigned patience, almost as if time itself had reshaped their perception of life. The psychological weight of the tower was amplified by its history. Prisoners knew that they were following in the footsteps of people who had come before queens, princes, advisors, nobles, all of them caught in the same rhythm of fear and waiting. The knowledge that others had endured the same experience offered a faint, ironic comfort. They were not alone, even in complete isolation. For the human mind, prolonged confinement in a place like the tower could transform character. Some prisoners emerged hardened, cautious, and politically astute. Others emerged fragile, timid, and disoriented. Their ability to navigate the outside world diminished after years of small routines and limited human interaction. Time had changed them in ways they might never fully understand. Even when the doors finally opened, and through it all, the tower itself remained impassive. Stone, silence, and shadow did not judge. It simply held the prisoners and their waiting within its walls. A quiet witness to the fragile, repetitive, and patient endurance of human life. Within the Tower of London, prisoners often discovered that the smallest comforts became the most important parts of life. Luxury, power, and influence were stripped away, leaving only basic survival and the minor privileges that could be earned or requested. Food, for example, was a daily concern. Some prisoners received simple meals: bread, cheese, gruel, perhaps a piece of meat or fish if they were important enough or had favour. The quality varied depending on the generosity of the king, the queen, or the current warden. Wine, butter, spices, things that were once abundant in courtly life became treasured luxuries, small reminders of a world they had lost. Even a warm loaf of bread or a fresh apple could lift spirits more than grand feasts ever had. Other comforts were more subtle. Permission to walk a short distance in the courtyards, to see sunlight for a few minutes each day, or to sit near a window and observe the river became precious. Guards sometimes allowed prisoners to have books, paper, or writing instruments. A pen and a piece of paper became tools not just for communication, but for preserving one's sanity. Writing letters, keeping journals, or sketching symbols on walls gave structure to the monotonous days and a faint sense of control over life. Prisoners sometimes had small tokens of connection to the outside world. A letter from a friend or family member could arrive after weeks or months, and even a single sentence of reassurance might provide comfort that no guard, meal, or bed ever could. Some carved initials or dates into the stone walls, tiny monuments to existence. Defiance or hope so that when they were gone, something of them would remain. Pets, when allowed, offered companionship in otherwise silent rooms. Birds, cats, or even small dogs could become lifelines for attention, affection, and routine. Their simple presence reminded prisoners that life existed beyond walls and locks. For the people of the tower, survival depended as much on cultivating these minor comforts as it did on avoiding political missteps. A warm blanket, a fresh loaf of bread, a letter from someone remembered, a walk in the sun, all of these small things carried immense psychological weight. They were markers of stability in a life otherwise defined by unpredictability and enforced patience. In the quiet of their rooms, as shadows stretched along the stone walls, prisoners learned that the world outside could continue without them. But life could still be meaningful, even in confinement. And it was often these small, seemingly insignificant comforts that made the long, slow days bearable proof that even in the harshest circumstances, human resilience could find a way to persist. One of the harshest realities for prisoners in the Tower of London was the uncertainty of communication. Letters were lifelines, yet they were fragile, slow, and often unreliable. A letter might be sent to the king, the queen, a relative, or a friend in court, asking for pardon, clemency, or simply acknowledgement, but many of these letters were delayed, intercepted, ignored, or lost entirely. Imagine spending weeks crafting a careful note, weighing every word, trying to convey loyalty without arrogance, desperation without weakness. You seal it, hand it to a guard, and hope it reaches someone with the power to help you. And then, nothing. Days pass, weeks, months, no reply, no sign that anyone outside remembers you. Sometimes the letter never arrives at all, trapped in bureaucracy, forgotten or quietly discarded. For prisoners, this silence could be maddening. Hope was a double-edged sword. The belief that someone outside might respond sustained them. But the lack of response deepened despair. They watched guards come and go, pacing the stone corridors, wondering if today would finally bring news or confirmation that they had been forgotten entirely. Even when letters did arrive, the responses could be cruelly unhelpful. A vague note from a royal advisor, a delayed answer from a distant cousin, or a refusal from the king might prolong imprisonment rather than ease it. One could spend years writing, hoping, pleading, while life outside continued uninterrupted, and the world gradually removed all traces of the prisoner's former significance. Some prisoners became adept at manipulating these communications. They wrote constantly, crafting arguments, emphasizing loyalty, flattering the right people, hinting at useful knowledge or connections. For the politically savvy, letters were more than messages, they were tools of survival, attempts to influence fate through careful words and patience. Yet even the most skillful letter writers faced the same ultimate uncertainty. The decision to release or execute remained entirely out of their hands, dependent on politics, fortune, or whim. Every letter sent was both a plea and a gamble, a fragile thread connecting the prisoner to a world moving on without them. In Sisve, the tower was not only a prison of stone and iron, it was also a prison of waiting and uncertainty. The prisoners lived in a liminal space, suspended between action and outcome, hope and despair, past and future. Each letter that left their hands or failed to was a small battle against the relentless, unchanging walls and the patient, enduring weight of history itself. Life in the Tower of London forced a strange kind of education. It was not in books, politics, or warfare. It was Oslo, quiet lesson in patience, humility, and the fragility of human ambition for those who spent years behind its walls. The tower taught that power could vanish in an instant, and that the world outside moved forward regardless of your presence or absence. Many prisoners entered believing their status, their wealth, or their loyalty would protect them. They were advisors, nobles, princes, or queens. They had influence, land, armies, and friends. They assumed that these things were permanent, or at least durable. The Tower showed them otherwise. Titles meant little when doors were locked. Influence counted for nothing when guards carried keys and orders from the king or queen determined every action. Friends could betray, letters could be ignored, alliances could shift overnight. The lessons were slow, subtle, and sometimes cruel. Within the Tower, the smallest actions gained significance. A well-timed letter, a polite gesture to a guard, or an unexpected favour from a sympathetic warden could change the trajectory of a prisoner's life. And yet, even these small measures of control were fragile. Decisions about freedom rested entirely in the hands of others, often driven by politics, fear, or superstition rather than justice or logic. Prisoners also learned the value of routine. Daily rituals, waking, praying, reading, walking. Writing became anchors in a life defined by uncertainty. Without routine, time blurred completely. The Tower taught that survival often depended not on dramatic action, but on enduring, waiting, and observing quietly. It was a lesson in resilience, though not the kind that made a person stronger in the world. Outside it was a resilience that preserved sanity and life within the stone walls. And yet there was another lesson. History has no mercy. Individuals come and go, ambitions rise and fall, and even kings and queens are remembered differently over time. The Tower outlasted all of its occupants, silent and patient, preserving their fears, regrets, and endurance long after they were gone. In Setzenza, the Tower unkind, cruel in its confinement, kind in its memory. The prisoners who emerged or those who were forgotten entirely carried these lessons with them. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they understood the delicate, precarious nature of life close to power, the slow erosion of expectation, and the subtle weight of time. The Tower was more than stone, guards, and keys. It was a quiet teacher of human endurance, patience, and the inescapable passage of history. Even today, visitors walking through the Tower can sense this. The walls seem to whisper not of violence or glory, but of waiting, reflection, and the slow, inevitable unfolding of time that shaped every life once, held within its shadow. Even now, centuries later, the Tower of London holds echoes of those who lived and waited inside. Not the echoes of laughter or speech, but of presence. Every stone wall, every narrow window, every heavy door carries hundreds of years of waiting, fear, hope, and quiet reflection. Prisoners once paced these same halls, writing letters that may never have been delivered, carving their names or symbols into the walls, marking their passage through time. Some of these marks survive to this day. Faint scratches in stone, small testaments to existence. They are reminders that even in confinement, humans seek connection. Proof that they were here, that they mattered. The Tower has a way of humbling visitors who stop to imagine its past. It is difficult to stand in one of its rooms without thinking of the lives that unfolded there, the princes who never ascended, the queens who were executed, the nobles who vanished from history while still alive. Their fears, their routines, their endless waiting linger invisibly, filling the spaces that were once full of private thoughts. silent prayers, and daily struggles. Even the quietest rooms were not empty. In their stillness, you can almost sense the rhythm of lives spent waiting. Waking, eating, walking in small circles. Writing, reading, sleeping, and starting again. Time was both the prisoner's companion and adversary. Days could stretch endlessly, yet years passed without notice. The tower taught that endurance itself becomes a form of survival, a subtle victory over the slow erosion of hope. Guards, ravens, and stone walls remain, silently observing. They are the witnesses that no one can bribe or ignore. For those who visit now, the tower's lesson is still palpable. Power is temporary, human ambition is fragile, and even the mightiest can be humbled by circumstance. But endurance, quiet reflection, and the ability to wait though often, unremarkable are enduring human qualities that leave traces even centuries later. The tower stands as a reminder that history is not only in battles, treaties, or coronations. It is in the small, private experiences of those who waited, wrote, hoped, and survived in silence. And though many of the people who entered its gates are long gone, their stories, their fears, and their patient waiting remain in the stone, in the shadows, and in the quiet that fills the fortress to this day. Time may have moved on, kingdoms may have risen and fallen, but the tower continues to hold the echoes of humanity's patience, endurance, and vulnerability, a silent chronicle of lives, forever intertwined with its walls. The Tower of London is a lesson in contrasts. Outside its walls, life surged forward markets. Politics, marriages, wars, births, deaths. Inside, life slowed to almost nothing. Every prisoner, regardless of rank, was subject to the same rules. Locked doors, guards' schedules, waiting for someone else to decide their fate. The tower reminded its occupants that power could vanish in a single day, and that influence mattered very little when stone walls enclosed you. Even the most ambitious nobles discovered this slowly, often painfully. Letters, bribes, petitions, whispered promises none guaranteed release. And yet, human nature compelled prisoners to continue trying. They wrote and pleaded, observed and waited, made minor deals with guards, or studied the political landscape beyond the walls. Their days became exercises in patience, endurance, and the careful preservation of hope. Some learned to accept the slow rhythms of life in confinement. They found comfort in small routines, rising at the same hour, reading familiar texts, carving dates or symbols into stone, observing the river, listening to the creak of doors, or watching ravens move across the courtyard. Routine became a refuge, a subtle assertion of control in a life otherwise dictated entirely by others. It was, perhaps, the only power they truly possessed, the ability to measure time, mark it, and live it deliberately, even as the outside world changed without them. Kings died, queens rose, wars were fought, but the tower remained, holding the slow, measured heartbeat of those who had entered its rooms. It preserved the quiet endurance of people who had once held influence, yet now depended entirely on patience. This lesson extends beyond history. Power is temporary. Life moves forward regardless of your personal struggles. Yet patience, reflection, and the quiet acts of survival, writing a letter, maintaining a routine, observing the world beyond your walls, carry a subtle strength. The tower demonstrates that endurance does not require grandeur or recognition. It requires persistence, calm, and the quiet courage to exist within limits imposed by forces beyond your control. For centuries, the tower held these lessons silently, allowing future generations to learn from the endurance of those who once waited there. It is more than stone and iron. It is a testament to human patience, the fragility of power, and the strange, quiet dignity that emerges when a life is defined not by freedom or ambition, but by the long, measured rhythm of waiting. Even now, walking through the Tower of London, it is impossible not to feel the weight of all that has happened within its walls. The tower is more than a building. It is a repository of human experience, a stone chronicle of ambition, fear, patience, and endurance. Every prisoner who entered left a trace not always visible, sometimes barely perceptible, but always present in the air, the silence and the rhythm of daily life. The tower's stone walls absorb the small details as much as the large events. The creak of a door, the faint echo of footsteps, the clinking of keys, these sounds, repeated endlessly over centuries. A constant background hum that framed the lives of prisoners. They marked the rhythm of existence in a way no outside world could replicate. A single day in the tower could feel as long as a year. And yet, from the perspective of history, those years passed quickly, swallowed into the endless timeline of events beyond the walls. Time in the tower was both cruel and merciful. Cruel, because it forced prisoners to confront the fragility of life and power. Merciful, because it allowed reflection, observation, and the slow development of patience. Those who could endure the monotony often survived. Not always unscathed, but intact enough to leave records, stories, and lessons behind. In Cisenza, the tower was less a place of punishment than a place of transformation, though transformation often came through the slow erosion of certainty and control. The guards, the keys, the ravens, and the stone itself witnessed everything without judgment. They observed the rise and fall of human emotion, hope, fear, despair, and occasional joy. They saw prisoners write letters, carve initials, pace endlessly, and dream of a world beyond the walls. They saw kings' decisions ripple through the lives of those who could no longer influence them. And they remained patient, silent, enduring as the people inside came and went. The tower teaches that history is not only made by grand gestures, battles, or laws. It is also made by the quiet endurance of individuals, by their private moments of reflection, by the small acts of survival and persistence that often go unnoticed. Every prisoner who waited, wrote, prayed, or simply existed within those walls contributed to a larger story, a human tapestry woven into stone, silence, and shadow, a story that the tower still holds, waiting for anyone patient enough to notice. And so, the tower endures, a silent teacher, a stone witness, and a keeper of time, reminding us that human lives, though fleeting, leave echoes that can outlast kingdoms, wars, and rulers themselves. For some prisoners in the Tower of London, there came a day when the routine changed. After months or years of the same sounds, the same meals, the same walks, and the same waiting, something would be different. Guards might arrive earlier than usual. The door might open at an unusual time. There might be more footsteps in the corridor than normal. Prisoners quickly learned that changes in routine usually meant important news. Sometimes the news was good. A release order, a transfer, permission to leave the tower and live under house arrest somewhere else. But sometimes the news was very bad. If a prisoner was to be executed, they were often informed only shortly before it happened. Executions for important. Prisoners sometimes took place inside the tower rather than in public, especially for nobles and royalty. This was considered more private and, in a strange way, more respectful. But it also meant the prisoner would walk only a very short distance from there, room to the place where their life would end. Imagine living for years in a few rooms, walking the same small paths every day, and then one day being told to walk a slightly different path, knowing it would be the last walk you would ever take. Many prisoners spent their final hours writing letters, praying, or talking quietly with priests or guards. Some were calm, some were frightened, some were quiet and resigned. After years of waiting, the uncertainty was finally over, even if the ending was not the one they had hoped for. For prisoners who were executed inside the tower, the world outside often continued as normal. Markets opened, boats moved along the river. People argued, worked, married, and lived their lives. News of the execution might spread slowly, or sometimes it was kept quiet for political reasons. This is another strange thing about history. Moments that were the most important, moments in one person's life were sometimes only small events in the larger world. The tower saw many of these endings. Quiet endings, early in the morning, behind walls, away from crowds. The tower did not celebrate or mourn. It simply continued doing what it had always done, holding people, watching history and waiting for the next prisoner, the next letter, the next decision, the next ending. And after each ending, the rooms would be cleaned, the doors locked again, and eventually someone new would arrive, carrying new fears, new hopes, and a new story that would slowly unfold within the same old stone walls. After a prisoner left the Tower of London, whether by release, transfer, or execution, the tower did not change very much. The room they lived in would be cleaned, their few belongings removed, the door locked again, and life inside the fortress would continue exactly as before. This is one of the strangest things about prisons. Castles and very old buildings. Individual lives feel extremely important while they are happening, but the building itself remains calm and unchanged. One person's tragedy becomes just another small part of a very long history. Sooner or later, another prisoner would arrive and live in the same room, walk the same corridors, look out of the same window, and listen to the same sounds at night. They might carve their own name into the wall next to the name of someone who had lived there years earlier. They might sit in the same place, thinking the same thoughts, worrying about the same uncertain future. The tower was full of repeating stories. A powerful person rises in court. They gain influence and enemies. Something goes wrong. They are arrested. They arrive by boat or through the main gate. They live in a room for months or years. They write letters. They wait. Then one day they leave. And then someone else arrives. And the entire story begins again. Over hundreds of years. This pattern repeated so many times that the tower almost became part of the political system itself. It was not just a prison. It was a place where political problems were stored. If a king did not trust someone but did not want to execute them immediately, he could send them to the tower. If a queen feared a rival, the rival could be sent to the tower if a noble became too powerful. The tower was waiting. The tower solved many problems for rulers, but it created very long, quiet problems for the prisoners inside. And yet, the tower was not only a place of endings. For some people, it was a place where they survived, learned patience, wrote important books, or simply lived long enough to see political situations change and eventually walk free. So the tower became something very unusual in history. It was a prison, but also a waiting room for history, a place where people waited to see whether history would remember them, forget them, free them, or end their story behind stone walls beside a slow, moving river. The Tower of London was, in many ways, not just a prison, but a waiting room for history. People did not always go there because they had committed crimes in the way. We think of crimes today. Many were there because of politics, religion, royal marriages, inheritance, or simply because someone powerful did not trust them anymore. So the tower filled with people who were waiting for history to make a decision about them. Some prisoners arrived when one king ruled and were released when the next king came to power. Others were imprisoned during religious conflicts and released when the country changed religion again. Some were arrested because of political conspiracies that were later forgotten. In many cases, prisoners were not released because they proved their innocence, but because the political situation changed and they were no longer important. This meant that inside the tower, prisoners paid very close attention to news from outside. News about the king's health, about wars, about marriages, about rebellions, about religion. Any major change in the country could mean a change in their own situation. If all king died, prisoners might suddenly have hope. If a rebellion succeeded, prisoners might be released. If a rebellion failed, prisoners might be executed. If a new advisor became powerful, prisoners connected to that advisor might be freed. So even though prisoners were locked inside, their lives were still controlled by events happening far away in battlefields, royal palaces, churches, and government rooms. They were trapped physically, but politically their fate was still moving with the world outside. This must have been a very strange way to live, completely powerless in daily life, but still deeply connected to national events that could decide whether you lived freely again or died as a traitor. The tower teaches us something important about history. History is not only big events like wars and coronations. History is also people sitting in rooms, waiting for news, hoping that something outside will change their life. Many important historical events probably felt very different depending on where you were. For a general on a battlefield, a battle was noise, chaos, and fear. For a king, it was strategy and power. But for a prisoner in the tower, a battle somewhere far away might mean only one thing. Maybe this will change my future. So, while the world outside was making history inside the tower, people were waiting for history to decide what would happen to them. And sometimes, history was very slow to decide. For many prisoners in the Tower of London, life was not defined by days or months, but by events. A normal person might measure time by seasons, harvests, birthdays, or holidays. A prisoner in the tower measured time by rumours, letters, and political news. Is the king ill? Has there been a rebellion? Is the queen pregnant? Has the minister fallen from power? Has the war been won or lost? These events could change everything for a prisoner. If a powerful enemy died, A prisoner might suddenly be released. If a political faction lost power, prisoners connected to that faction might be executed. If a new ruler came to the throne, many prisoners might be pardoned simply because the new ruler wanted a fresh start. So prisoners listened carefully for any news from outside. Guards sometimes talked. Servants sometimes whispered. Letters sometimes contained hints. Even small pieces of information could create hope or fear that lasted for weeks. Imagine living in a place where a single sentence of news could completely change your future. The king is dead. Those 4 words could mean freedom for one prisoner and death for another. This is how closely the lives of Tower prisoners were connected to the unpredictable world of politics. They were locked in stone rooms, but their fate was moving with armies, kings, queens, and ministers far away. Sometimes, after years of waiting, a prisoner would suddenly be told they were free. No long explanation, no apology. Just an order they could leave. After years in a small room, the door would open, and they would walk out into a world that had changed without them. Other prisoners waited just as long and received very different news. This uncertainty was perhaps the hardest. Part of life in the Tower, not knowing if you would leave tomorrow, next year, or never. Not knowing if you were forgotten or still being discussed in royal meetings. Not knowing if history was moving toward your freedom or toward your execution. So life in the Tower was mostly waiting. Waiting for letters. Waiting for news. Waiting for decisions. Waiting for history to move. And sometimes, after very long periods of silence, history finally did move. And when it moved, everything could change in a single day. In a strange and quiet way, the Tower of London was one of the few places in the kingdom where power, wealth, and status slowly stopped mattering. Not immediately, but over time. When prisoners first arrived, their rank still mattered. Important nobles were given better rooms. Wealthy prisoners could pay for better food, furniture, servants, books, and sometimes even tapestries to hang on the walls to make the rooms warmer and more comfortable. Poorer prisoners lived in much harsher conditions. But after months or years, something interesting happened. Everyone was still locked inside. The noble with a decorated room and the prisoner in a small, cold chamber were both still prisoners. They both waited for letters. They both listened for footsteps in the corridor. They both watched the same sky through different windows. They both depended on decisions made by people outside the Tower. Time slowly made their lives more similar than different. This is why the Tower can be seen as a strange equalizer. Outside the Tower, society was extremely strict about rank and class. Inside the Tower, time treated everyone the same way. Days passed slowly for everyone. Waiting felt long for everyone. Uncertainty affected everyone. A duke could not unlock his own door. A general could not command the guards. A bishop could not pray his way out immediately. A royal cousin could not simply walk away. Inside the Tower, everyone was just a person waiting in a room. This must have been a very strange experience for people who had spent their entire lives being powerful and important. Many prisoners entered the Tower thinking about their titles, their land, their influence, their political alliances. But after years of waiting, those things probably felt very far away and not very useful. Instead, life became simple again. Food, sleep, letters, weather, health, hope. These became the important things. In a way, the tower reduced life to its most basic form. Not power, not wealth, not fame, just time and waiting and survival and hope. And perhaps that is one of the quiet reasons the Tower of London is still so fascinating today. It is not only a place of executions and prisoners and kings and queens. It is a place where powerful people slowly learned that they were just people. People who ate, slept, worried, hoped, waited, and wondered what would happen tomorrow. People who discovered that time is stronger than power, and that sometimes the hardest thing a human being can do is nothing at all, except wait. Over time, the role of the Tower of London slowly began to change. In the medieval and Tudor periods, it was one of the most important prisons in England, especially for political prisoners and important nobles. But as centuries passed, governments changed, laws changed, and the way prisoners were treated also changed. Gradually, the tower was used less and less as a prison for important political figures. New prisons were built, courts became more organised, and the government no longer relied on a medieval fortress to hold its political enemies. The world was changing, and the tower was slowly becoming more of a symbol than an active prison. By the 1700s and 1800s, the tower was used mainly for military purposes, storing weapons, training soldiers, and protecting important national treasures like the crown jewels. It still had guards, walls, and gates. But it was no longer full of nobles writing letters and waiting for the king's decision. One of the last times the tower was used to hold prisoners was during major wars, when spies or important military prisoners were kept there. But these were very different from the political prisoners of earlier centuries. The long period when queens, princes, bishops, and powerful nobles waited inside the tower was mostly over. The tower had moved from being an active part of political life to being a historical place, a symbol of royal power and English history. But buildings remember their past, even when their purpose changes. The rooms where prisoners once slept were still there. The walls with carved names were still there. The gates where prisoners entered were still there. The courtyards where guards walked were still there. The river still flowed past the walls exactly as it had hundreds of years earlier. The tower did not forget what it had been, even if the world outside had changed. Today, people visit the tower as a museum and a historic site. They come to see the crown jewels, the ravens, the old weapons, the towers and the famous buildings. They take pictures and listen to guides tell stories about prisoners and kings and queens. But if you walk slowly through the tower and think about its history, you realise something interesting. For hundreds of years, this place was not a tourist attraction. It was a place where people waited to find out if they would live free. Or en cette long, quieterist, is sitting inside the stone wall, even though the doors are now open and the prisoners are gone. Today, the Tower of London is no longer a place of fear in the way it once was. No nobles are sent there by royal order. Prisoners arrive by boat through Traitors Gate, and no one waits in a stone room for years hoping for a letter from the king. The tower is now a place of memory, but memory can be a powerful thing. When people visit the tower today, they often come to see the crown jewels, the famous ravens, the armour, the towers, and the old medieval buildings. They walk through the gates with cameras and guidebooks. They listen to stories about kings, queens, executions, and prisoners. For many visitors, it is an interesting historical place, something to learn about and photograph. But if you walk slowly and quietly, the tower feels different. The walls are very thick. The windows are very small. The doors are very heavy. The staircases are narrow and spiral in tight circles. The rooms are made of stone that stays cold even in summer. Everything about the tower was built for security, for defence, for control. It was not built to be comfortable. When you stand in one of the small rooms and look at the walls, you might see carvings, names, dates, symbols. These were made by prisoners hundreds of years ago. They did not carve those names for tourists. They carved them because they were alone, because they were bored, because they were afraid, or because they wanted to leave proof that they existed. I was here. I lived in this room. I did not disappear completely. Those carvings are very quiet messages from the past. The tower is full of these quiet messages, not loud stories of battles and kings, but quiet stories of waiting, writing, hoping, and sometimes losing hope. History often talks about kings and wars and great events, but places like the tower remind us that history is also about individuals, sitting alone in rooms, thinking about their lives and their mistakes and their uncertain future. So today, the tower is like a memory made of stone, a memory of power, a memory of fear, a memory of waiting, a memory of time passing slowly. And when people walk through it now, they are not just visiting a castle. They are walking through hundreds of years of human stories, most of which were quiet, slow, and full of waiting beside a river that never stopped moving. And so, our long, quiet journey through the Tower of London slowly comes to an end. For hundreds of years. This fortress beside the river was a place where some of the most powerful, most ambitious, and sometimes most unfortunate people in England came to wait. Not always to die, not always to be punished, but almost always to wait. Waiting for letters, waiting for news, waiting for kings and queens to change their minds, waiting for history to move in their favour. Some walked out free. Some walked out old and forgotten. Some never walked out at all. But the tower remained. That is the strange thing about history. People believe they are living in the most important moment, dealing with the most important problems, making the most important decisions. And for them, at that moment, it is all very important. But time keeps moving, like the river beside the tower. And slowly those moments become stories. And those stories become history. And history becomes quiet. The prisoners of the tower worried about their reputations, their families, their power, their future. They wrote letters trying to explain themselves, defend themselves, or beg for mercy. They walked in small rooms, looked out small windows, and tried to imagine what was happening in the world outside. They did not know that hundreds of years later, people would still talk about the tower, still visit it, still tell stories about the people who were once locked inside its walls. In a strange way, many of the prisoners were not completely forgotten after all. The tower, which was meant to hide people, ended up preserving their stories. And now, the tower is quiet. No more prisoners waiting for letters from the king. No more guards bringing news of execution or release. No more nobles pacing in stone rooms, listening for footsteps in the corridor. Now there are only visitors, cameras, guides, and ravens walking slowly across the grass. But if you stand very quietly in one of the old rooms, you can almost imagine what it was like. The slow days, the long nights, the sound of keys, the sound of the river, the feeling of waiting for something you cannot control. The Tower of London is no longer a prison, but it is still a place about time, about how slowly time can move when you are waiting, about how quickly time can pass when history looks back, and about how, in the end, stone walls, rivers, and stories often last much longer than the people who once worried inside them. So tonight, as we leave the tower and let its heavy doors close quietly behind us, we leave it the way many prisoners once did, slowly, quietly and thoughtfully. The river is still moving. The tower is still standing. And history, as always, is still moving forward, very slowly.